I've come to the realization that I'm addicted to combat, and everything I've done in my life has been in the pursuit of taking human life more efficiently. I'm a veteran of the Eritrean War of Independence and fought in the Eritrean People's Liberation Front against Ethiopia. My parents were well-to-do intellectuals for the region, and I received a commendable education given the circumstances. Their involvement with the ELF, the Eritrean Liberation Front, an older group predating the EPLF, got them killed when I was only 17. From there on, I fought wherever I could, whenever I could, in official capacities and in retaliative guerrilla actions against the Ethiopian army. During the course of nearly a decade, I took the lives of dozens in what you might understand as typical long-range warfare, and several with knives and bayonets, in moments of desperation and moments of outright murder. Every friend I made during that time died in the conflict. I'm not alive because of my own skill, but because of luck. That being said, I took to the circumstances pretty naturally. It was only a few months into this that I was no longer fighting for vengeance, but for the sake of fighting. I had never felt so alive as when I was close to death. In moments of thought, I began to see it as a grand game rather than a brutal war of human rights and a slaughter of innocent civilians. I wondered what in life could be more challenging than to face another human, an equal, in a game of the greatest stakes imaginable. For once, to be truly sure that both you and the other man were operating at the absolute peak of your mental and physical prowess. To face that great engine of intellect and emotions that is the mind, and to win. What is war but the ultimate utilization of a man's combined knowledge in every single field imaginable in order to attain that victory? Everything else in comparison felt arbitrary, watered down. I feel that I should clarify that this is not a manifestation of sociopathy that led to this mindset. If anything, I had an abundance of empathy once I accepted the death of my family members. I found that I could not hate those that I killed. I tried to understand their position, their emotions they must have felt, that inside they were the same as me, a human mind doing what it thought was best, or what it was ordered to do. I even briefly felt love for my fellow man, a moment of sadness. He didn't ask for this. He must have had ambitions, dreams, loved ones, all just as meaningful as my own. But I pulled the trigger anyway. When Eritrea finally gained its independence and recognition from the UN, I began the process of immigrating to the United States, and I achieved just that. I quickly found entry-level industrial work and committed myself to it fully while pursuing higher-level education. I studied psychology but quickly became more interested in physics and engineering, in practical pursuits with the time and money that I had to invest. But it was not for any aspirations of careers in these fields. I'll get to that later. Over the years, I've become jaded. No one here had even heard of the conflict that I took part in, much less could they relate to it. I adopted cover stories for who I really was, and rarely socialized. Even when I found a few reliable dear friends, some of them veterans of the US military, I found sharing and coping to be a waste of time. It took me some time to understand that despite everything I learned with my new education, that I was not in fact traumatized very much at all by what I had done. Nor did I seem to exude any of the traits of schizophrenia, sociopathy, or psychopathy. I didn't want to hurt anyone, you understand, and I was never worried that I could have been a threat to those around me. I was and am a rather boring, neurotypical person in most respects. I've stopped and helped people who've needed it. I own and take responsible care of pets. I have no anger problems or issues with outbursts, and I've talked one of my friends out of taking his own life over the guilt that he feels from being in the military. I then directed him to get professional help. I have no interest in harming anyone not also trying to harm me. And yet, while I sit here now in safety and comfort, in a house earned by my own hard work in a country where I never need my prior skills again, all I can think of is that it's all been so I can fight once more, to fight better. I have improved mentally, physically, and spiritually, and although I'm now past middle age, I could win against my younger self 1,000 times over. all I want is to fight again, in war, in personal combat, on behalf of my own life and nothing else. No cause, no justification, no excuses, just fighting for the sake of fighting. As I said before, combat and war to me is the ultimate utilization of man's efforts. There's been almost no subject that I've not gleaned some idea on how to improve something, whether it be technique, philosophy, strategy. And although it has secured me a valuable career, I'd like to use my education to make me a better fighter. Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, Kant and Aristotle. I've looked to every wise man to refute my obsession. I've talked with psychiatrists and psychologists who have not fared any better and cannot seem to classify what I am. I feel remorse for those I killed so long ago, but not regret. My support of Nietzsche's eternal recurrence makes the concept irrelevant anyway. I felt most akin to Kierkegaard's Night of Faith as an aside, the only thing that comes close to a semblance of understanding my mindset. I'm not sure why I'm posting this in the end. I don't expect understanding or sympathy. Maybe this is just to reach out to others of similar mindsets, if there are any out there. Perhaps to entertain a few denizens of the world with the story of a veteran in a conflict that they'll never care about, for understandable reasons. This is a confession, whatever the case. In a few years, I'll travel to some war-torn country in Africa or the Middle East. I'll find a conflict, I'll fight in it, and I'll die after some period of success or immediate failure. To secure ourselves against defeat lies in our own hands, but the opportunity of defeating the enemy is provided by the enemy himself. Eventually, one will not provide it, or I'll simply be shattered to pieces by a bomb, or run over, or die of malaria. I don't hold romantic notions of the consequences. No matter what happens, I'll be happy. For the first time in a very long time, I'll be alive again. I'm going to share with you the time that I beat up my grandmother. This isn't something that I've ever shared with anyone, and trust me, there's a lot to say. Before I get started though, I need to give you some context. My grandmother was not a kind woman. She had her moments, but she was hardened from an early age, and towards the end became deeply mentally disturbed. She was married off at 13 or 14, having 11 children total, of which only 3 survived past the age of 5. She and my grandfather fought in World War II, and they both got medals to prove it. After the war, they moved to Germany for 15 years, working their asses off to send money back to her sister-in-law, who was taking care of the children. My mother spent most of her childhood thinking that her aunt and uncle were her parents. In her old age, my grandmother got diabetes, and she had to deal with some batshit crazy neighbors, of which I'm sure she was one of them. She didn't have an easy life. As my grandmother got older, she became more and more bitter, then mean, then switched to downright evil. When one of her sisters, who had lost her husband during the war and had spent most of her life a widow, found an older gentleman and decided to marry again, my grandmother called her a whore, a slut, a stupid embarrassment to the family, and she shared this with anybody she ever met. Her own sister, who I refer to as Auntie Flora, the kindest person I'd ever met, because she is in fact the kindest person I have ever met, to the point of martyrdom even. My grandmother never liked the woman that my uncle married, but saying never liked her is such a light way to express the deep hatred that she fostered toward this woman. About 10 years ago, my uncle died of lung cancer from smoking 2 packs a day for almost 20 years. During the funeral, my grandmother cussed out my aunt, screaming that she had murdered my uncle, screaming that my aunt should have been the one to die instead of her son, because she was a whore that trapped him and a witch that had cast a spell on him. I was tasked with restraining my grandma and keeping her away from the crowd until she calmed down. But she never did. She just missed her son's funeral. I listened to her rant for hours and hours, all the while wishing that my aunt was the one that was being buried, wishing that my granddad would just jump off a waterfall and spare her his old age, wishing that my cousins would go to jail and be forgotten to rot in a cell. The whole gamut, basically. When my grandparents became too old to care for themselves, my cousin, who's the daughter of my uncle, the one named after my grandmother, started visiting daily to make sure that they were okay, bring them medicine, cook and clean a little bit. But during the time that my cousin spent there, my grandmother would just berate her with insults, calling her a useless, worthless piece of shit, a manipulative who only cared for them to steal their money, which was funny to say because they didn't have any. Once when my cousin was leaving, my grandma tried to trip her so she would fall down the stairs and break her neck. She would also purposefully take dumps outside of the toilet, just so my cousin would have to clean it up. During that time, my grandma would tease her, saying, "Look at you, covered in shit, just where you belong." She told her repeatedly, "I hope you never have kids because you don't deserve anyone to love you." That's how my grandma fought. Everyone in the family, her kids most of all, had had their earful, refilled every couple of months for years of their life. As I said, my grandmother wasn't a kind woman. I was studying abroad one year and came back to my home country for Christmas. My grandma's house was technically 2 independent apartments, one above the other, so we usually stayed with her when we visited. It was a 10-hour flight, after which I jumped in a rental car and drove all the way north to where my grandma lived. Total travel time was around 15 hours. I was sleepy, jet-lagged, and overall exhausted. I arrived at my grandma's place, spent some time with her, my mom, Auntie Flora, and my mom's cousins. It was a quiet, surprisingly civil evening, and I was happy to be home. After a little while of hanging out, I made the mistake of saying that I was really tired and I'd head to bed early. My grandma pointed me towards a spare bedroom next to where we were all gathered, and I pointed out that we're a rowdy crowd and I wouldn't be able to sleep through the noise. Moreover, both my grandma and my mom would wake up early most days, and the subsequent fights that they would get into always woke me up as well. I said that I'd like to go sleep upstairs. My grandma said no. My mother asked again politely. My grandma again said no. We asked her why. She said she just didn't want me to go upstairs to sleep. No other reason than I don't wanna. I was too tired, too sleepy to argue, but the rest of the crowd tried to reason with her. Well, soon after, it became a screaming match, at which point everyone except my mom and Auntie Flora left. And that's when the gloves came off. Amongst the swearing and the screaming, the cussing, the threatening, I heard 3 things. "I'm glad your husband died. He was a great man and you didn't deserve him. You ruined his life when you married him, so I'm glad he's dead and doesn't have to put up with you. I'm glad your other kids were killed so young, so they wouldn't have to put up with you as a mother. I hope you and your daughter get cancer. I hope she, who was me in this situation, dies first, slowly, so you can be completely alone in the world. I had an older brother and a younger sister that were killed in an accident when I was 4. My father died of a heart attack when I was 12. I don't know how it happened, but all of a sudden, I was neither tired nor sleepy anymore. I wasn't angry or sad. I was fully awake, fully functional, and had perfect clarity. My mom was now out in the yard crying. My Auntie Flora followed her outside to comfort her. I stood up, perfectly calm, and walked up to where my grandmother was sitting, smirking at me as I approached. And then I entered what I can only describe as psycho mode. Without saying a word, I grabbed my grandmother's head and smashed it against the wall. She looked up at me surprised, dazed, more hatred gathering on her face. As she was getting over the shock, I told her very calmly and very quietly, "If you ever speak to my mother again that way, that'll be the last thing you do." She started to scream and tried to grab my hand. I pushed her hands away, once again grabbed her head and smashed it against the wall, somehow having the clarity and ability to do it just hard enough that I wouldn't break her fragile skull. I took a step back and noticed my fingers were bleeding. 2 of my fingernails had broken off and were now embedded in my grandmother's scalp. Again, very quietly, looking into her panicked eyes with this perfect calm, I said again, "If you ever speak to my mother again like that, I'll kill you. Do you understand?" She nodded. I walked away from her, went to the freezer, put some ice cubes in a towel, and brought them back to her. She hadn't moved, and it took her a few moments to raise a hand and get the towel from my hands. If ever there was a face perfectly capturing utter shock and fear, hers would be it. We're going to go sleep at Auntie Flora's tonight. I don't want you to say another word until we leave. And if you ever speak a word of this to anyone, that'll be it for you. Do you understand? One more nod. My mom came back in a few minutes later, and I told her that we'd be going to sleep at Auntie Flora's. My grandma was eerily quiet as we were all packing up, and 5 minutes later, we were taking our suitcases down to the car. My mom said goodnight to my grandma. I just stared at her, daring her to respond. She looked at me with such hatred that I could almost taste it. She just nodded towards my mom, and I smiled and waved at her as I closed the door behind us. My mom tried to ask me what happened. What did I do to calm down my grandmother? I told her if Grandma ever talks to her this way again, that she could say something like, "Wait until your granddaughter hears about this." My mom asked me if I had threatened my grandma. I remember driving. I remember which corner I turned. I remember how the car lights lit the trees and the road up when I responded to her, still incredibly calm. I didn't threaten her. I informed her of her options. You have nothing to worry about. My mom never asked me about it again. It took me 2 whole days to get over that state of total dissociation. I couldn't even look at my mom without crying, feeling so ashamed, so utterly mortified and confused. I had beaten up my grandmother, this old woman of 84 years. It's not as if I didn't know how my grandmother fought. She always said things like that. She was just an old, cranky, disturbed woman. They were just words. She raised me through much of my early childhood. She always sent me gifts for my birthday. She was always happy to see me, even if it only lasted for a little while. I struggled for years trying to justify what I did, but more so trying to convince myself that I would never go through with it. I would never actually harm her. It was horrifying to realize that if push came to shove, I actually would. I only ever saw my grandmother again when she was in the hospital dying, 4 years later. I was both relieved and utterly disgusted to hear the family say how much she had mellowed out these last few years and had not uttered a single swear word at anyone. I found that hard to believe, but I'll probably spend the rest of my life believing that our interaction played at least some part in that. As we get closer to the holidays, I find myself thinking more and more about how blessed I am with the life that I have. A loving family, a successful career, a beautiful wife who I love more than anything. But at the same time, this time of year makes me cringe when I think back to the life that I used to live. All the names and locations in this confession have been altered, but with a nod to old memories not being 100% reliable, what I confess here is absolutely true. Also, before I begin, let me state that I'm not proud of this period of my life. I'm utterly ashamed of it. Out of high school, I went to work at a manufacturing plant, one that my father and his father before him had both worked at their entire lives. I made pretty decent money and owned my first house when I was only 19, while most of my friends were working shitty jobs and living in small, shitty dorms at various universities. I thought of them as suckers at the time, but despite my decent pay, it was never enough. Enter James. James I had gone to high school with, but I hardly knew him back then. Like me, he had a fake ID and frequented a very sleazy bar or strip joint just outside of our hometown. I didn't have many friends at that point because most of them were away at college, improving their lives. I guess that's why I gravitated towards James in the first place. Eventually, we started hanging out regularly, and for a time, I even let him live at my house. Well, one day we're hanging out. James asked me if I'd like to make $400 cash. I mean, who wouldn't? All I had to do was drive a car of his from the city nearby to a city about 4 hours away. That was it. He'd even give me an extra $50 to buy a bus ticket home after. So I did it without asking any further questions. That's how it all began. Every few weeks, he'd ask me if I'd be willing to do it again. And though I knew something shady must be going on, I figured, what the hell? All I had to do was drive, drop the car off at a certain address, and then catch a bus back home. It was easy money. I didn't even have to interact with anyone. Well, one day during one of the drives, the car that I was in, which was a junker, they always were, got a flat tire. When I opened the trunk to get out the spare, I saw a large black duffel bag, the kind that hikers use to pack up large tents. But I knew there was no tent inside. When I opened it, I was only mildly surprised to see it filled to the brim with firearms. I never mentioned the flat or my discovery of the guns to James. The money was far too good and I didn't want to piss him off. But over time, we just eventually and naturally cut out all the bullshit. We stopped using code words, stopped pretending that I didn't know what I was doing. About a year later, I knew full well that I was transporting either guns or drugs, and usually both. We had even upped the routine to doing these runs every other weekend. I asked for and received a raise, $600 a trip plus expenses. I never met the people on the other end during this time. I would just drop off the car at either a house or apartment complex in the other city, then get the fuck out of there. Meanwhile, back at home, James had become my best friend. He knew how to party. He knew everyone at the local bars and clubs, and he must have gotten me laid at least a dozen times. And I'm talking with girls who were hot as fuck. I had serious girlfriends during this time too, but whenever I had some kind of beef with James, he'd show up at my door with some young hottie that barely spoke English. At this time, I had my blinders on, and I chose to believe that these girls were just on this side of legal. While I had an inkling in the back of my mind, the more important thing to me at that point was that they were fun, and they always showed me a good time. I knew in the back of my head that these girls were being mistreated, that they were sex workers, although the term worker might be rather generous for what they were having to do. Yet, I ignored all my reservations. I liked being around them, and I treated them like shit because it made me feel good somehow. Eventually, James asked me to drive 3 girls to the other city and drop them off at a bar. They were transferring. That's the term that he used. I agreed to the job, and during that drive, one of them tried to escape during a stop at a rest area. She threw open the door and took off running as soon as I stopped the car. I chased her down, tackled her, and dragged her back to the car while she wailed in tears and blubbering things in Polish or Russian. After that, I still didn't stop. I ran the girls too, but now I bound their ankles together with twine before we'd leave. I ran them both ways, from my city to the other and back. I still ran the drugs and the guns too, and I made a lot of money in the process. Everything began to finally change for me when James had asked me to help him to start recruiting locals. I know it's horrible, but the foreign girls were easy to ignore since I never really understood them. Only 1 in 3 ever knew much English, and even then, they were usually pretty quiet. But local girls? They weighed on my conscience. I suddenly saw them as human. One in particular begged me to bring her home, and she was as young as my little sister, so I did. I took her back to her parents. The scariest moment of my life was when James showed up at my house after that. He was furious, and like any other night, he was carrying. He actually drew his piece on me. I don't know how, but somehow I talked him down from murdering me right then and there. I did a few more runs for him after that, but no women or girls. Eventually, I got lucky. The plant that I worked at had ordered increased production, 7-day work weeks. James knew that he couldn't pay me enough to make up for quitting that job, so he accepted the fact that I could no longer be one of his runners. And after a few months, he stopped even asking me. I got my shit together during that time. I became very religious, as the guilt for what I had done had started to consume me. I remain religious to this day, though not as much as back then. Eventually, I ended up becoming one of the suckers that I used to sneer at. I went back to school. I got a degree and have been working in my field of study ever since. I have no idea how or why I got so lucky. Had I been pulled over once in any of those drives, I believe that my life would have been fucked. Those days will forever haunt my nightmares, though. When I think of those poor girls especially, my own daughters are older than some of the ones that I used to drive back then. To this day, too, whenever I read about a shooting in that city, the one that I had brought so many guns to over the years, I wonder if possibly one of those weapons had been delivered there by me. The drug overdoses, too. All the lives ruined by the drugs that I ferried there. The word regret doesn't even begin to encapsulate what I feel.